So this talk contains illustrations of a pixelated phallus attached to the front of a gun. And this talk also includes sexist language directed toward women, both within the game and as taken from a men's rights forum poster. So I just want to make sure everyone's aware of that before I start. So Anthropy's realistic female first-person shooter begins with an establishing shot of a pixelated gun. Its barrel and trigger look a lot like a fleshy, ribbed dildo with a Prince Albert piercing at the tip. A text box reads, "Here she is, the McManus 5000. A real beauty, eh? She weighs about 5,000 tons, but I'm sure your woman arms will be able to lift it." In realistic female first-person shooter, you are set up for failure. The player is constantly and condescendingly gendered by her male superior, who asks her to perform basic tasks that appear in first-person shooters, sprinting from one location to another, lifting and readying her gun, shooting enemies out of the air. In most first-person shooters, these actions are coded through simple, fluid, and immediate inputs. Sprinting toggles with the press of a button. Readying your weapon occurs within seconds. The player's line of sight is usually clear, and she has a sense of awareness of space and the targets and enemies she is tasked with shooting. Realistic female first-person shooter, however, constantly reminds the player of her inability to act. Simple actions in FPS games, like moving through space, are often enacted through a single press of the W key or a tilt of the joystick. In RF FPS, moving forward can only occur if the player repeatedly mashes the W key. And I have a very short clip to demonstrate. It's wonderful. Her character inches and lurches forward bit by bit, a female voice grunting loudly as she moves. In order to ready her weapon, she is forced to click rapidly, her weapon falling between every click. When she shoots down enemy planes, most of the screen is blocked from view, and the crosshairs lurch this way and that, actively preventing her from having a clear view of the enemy or the space she's surrounded by. And I also have another short list as well. And that sound is the sound of her weapon running out of bullets. As the player mashes buttons and tries to shoot a hard-to-see enemy out of the air, she becomes more and more aware that the game refuses to respond to her input. She becomes aware of the interface of the game, of the meeting of body to machine, and the distinct separation that exists between the two. There is no immersion in RFFPS. The player, over the course of the game, is aware of how her body is limited and controlled by the game instead of liberated by it. The first-person shooter is a genre that Alex Galloway has broadly described as, quote, an allegory of liberation, pure and simple, end quote. He writes that, quote, the shooter as genre and the shooter as act are bound together in intimate unity. The shooter is not a stand-in for activity. It is activity, end quote. Galloway writes about the first-person shooter as a genre that seamlessly ties together the desires of the player with her ability to act. When the player presses a button, the resulting action is effortless and immediate. She is liberated by the game and its ability to let her move and act freely. Realistic female first-person shooter, however, deliberately pushes against these assumptions about empowerment and liberation. It prioritizes affects like frustration and powerlessness, and positions the interface of the game as unresponsive to the player's desires and inputs, presenting not an allegory of liberation, but an allegory of confinement. Affect and emotions, particularly unpleasant or uncomfortable affects, can be used to queer a person's relationship to interactive technologies. Affects like frustration can be used to illuminate norms or expectations that exist around the way video games are theorized as liberatory and immersive. While Janet Murray's inventing of the medium principles of interaction design as cultural practice is not predominantly focused on affect, frustration and the avoidance of frustration are repeated themes in her book. Murray writes about frustration as an affect that is indicative of the way that interfaces respond or do not respond to human input. She writes,
Interactors have an expectation that they will be able to manipulate digital artifacts and make things happen in response to their actions. They will therefore become frustrated and impatient when they are not allowed to act. End quote. Affect, particularly feelings of frustration, is generated by the ways in which acts are allowed or not allowed within software systems and in real-world space, and whether a player expects to have control over them. Frustration, then, is connected directly to bodies and whether they are aware of their limitations. Wendy Chun writes in Control and Freedom that, importantly, the choices operating systems offer limit the visible and invisible, the imaginable and unimaginable. You are not, however, aware of software's constant constriction and interpolation, also known as user-friendliness, unless you find yourself frustrated with its defaults. End quote. Chun points out that the interface, or the meeting between body and machine, only becomes visible as a barrier or boundary when the user becomes frustrated. Interface exists in several different forms. First, the visual interface of the screen that allows the user to interact with and be aware or not aware of the software's code and the presence of virtual space and representations within it. Second, the hardware interfaces that the user manipulates while interacting with software, from clicking the mouse and pressing a key on the keyboard to moving a joystick. And thirdly, I propose the idea of the affective interface that software produces, or affect, and importantly, feelings of discomfort or comfort or extension or confinement when interacting with software are indicative of particular historical and material relationships between bodies, space, and technology. How might we consider the ways in which software and game interfaces might deliberately provoke frustration and discomfort in order to make the player hyper-aware of her veiled disempowerment in relationship to software systems? How might we consider this queering of interface, this hypervisibility of interface as a boundary or barrier, as a concept that allows us to look more closely at the ways in which software interpolates or addresses certain users and estranges others? Anthropy's realistic female first-person shooter offers a possibility for how frustration and unresponsive interface might be mobilized deliberately in queer games. In RFFPS, frustration and discomfort are pointedly used to make clear that certain objectives, goals, or outcomes are structurally impossible for the player, pushing against neoliberal, white, and privileged assumptions that the player might be able to win or have power over a game if only she invests time and effort into, quote-unquote, overcoming the system. Instead, games like RFFPS utilize affects like frustration to illuminate the limitations of the user and the ways in which she is not inherently a part of or complicit with the software, revealing that she is, in fact, separate from and controlled by it instead. The game addresses a queer or unexpected subject by purposefully refusing the player's ability to be extended, to feel safe or at home in the virtual spaces of the game. The games I examine in my work purposefully do not let the player win, do not allow the player to move freely, and dramatically restrict the player's ability to choose. Games like realistic female first-person shooter call attention to the constructedness of the expectation of immersion, safety, and seamlessness within space. It calls attention to norms and standards that we have come to accept as the default within video games, standards that address a certain kind of privileged and empowered white and male player. RFFPS utilizes the limitations of video game worlds to recreate the phenomenological and affective experience of being other, an experience that critiques the ways in which mainstream video games address some subjects as the norm while estranging others. The gameplay in realistic female first-person shooter is alienating. The options the player is given within the game are really not options at all, and she is often forced to choose between equally insulting lines of dialogue. Instead of being able to reload your weapon, an act that is often carried out autonomously by the player within first-person shooter genres, the player is forced into a multi-step process to consult the captain and ask him to do it for you. Even though the player is given dialogue options, the only option is to admit that she doesn't know what she's doing. In one exchange, the two options are, I seem to be out of bullets, and I'm scared, sir. When the captain asks, scared, the only thing I fear is being unable to serve my planet, the player's two dialogue options are, my gun is out of bullets, and you're so brave, sir. The game's choices and options present the illusion of choice through a limited number of possibilities. No matter what the player does, the game moves her forward along the same narrative line. It reveals the thinly veiled reality that the choices within the game are really closed off and predetermined, and not endlessly open to possibility. Frustration is deeply connected to the idea of comfort and discomfort, terms defined by Sarah Ahmed in The Cultural Politics of Emotion. Frustration is a component of the affect of discomfort that illuminates interfaces, particularly the body's relationship to the spaces of control that surround it, and the way it interfaces with both real-world spaces and the virtual spaces within software. Ahmed writes that, quote, "To be comfortable is to be so at ease with one's environment that it is hard to distinguish where one's body ends and the world begins. The disappearance of the surface is instructive. In feelings of comfort, bodies extend into spaces, and spaces extend into bodies," end quote. Comfort is an affect that is indicative of seamlessness, of the idea that the body is seamlessly integrated with the machine, where desire to act seamlessly moves to action. The assumption of control and power over space is rooted in the affect of comfort, where it seems as though the body is capable of extending into and becoming a part of the game system and its spaces. In short, feelings of comfort reproduce the experience and illusion of seamlessness, control, and liberation. On the other hand, discomfort, as Ahmed describes, quote, "is a feeling of disorientation. One's body feels out of place, awkward, and unsettled. I know that feeling too well. The sense of out-of-placeness and estrangement involves an acute awareness of the surface of one's body, which appears as surface, when one cannot inhabit the social skin, which is shaped by some bodies and not others," end quote. Discomfort is an affect that produces an awareness of the surfaces of interaction and the way that certain bodies fit into norms impressed by other bodies. It brings to light the interface that separates the user from her ability to control and manipulate code, from her ability to experience the seamlessness between body and virtual game space. The players experienced estrangement from these spaces through discomfort and uncomfortable affects like frustration allow for a heightened awareness of bodily surfaces, and similarly, an awareness of the surfaces that separate and estrange the user from the spaces and illusions of control afforded by the game system. Interface is a matter of surfaces meeting, of body meeting machine. Whether the body's surface becomes seamless with the surface of interactive technologies determines the level of comfort and extension, or discomfort and frustration a user might feel. There are certain bodies that are designed to fit into the idea of the expected user that a video game addresses. Ahmed writes that, quote, "Compulsory heterosexuality, defined as the accumulative effect of the repetition of the narrative of heterosexuality as an ideal coupling, shapes what it is possible for bodies to do, even if it does not contain what it is possible to be," end quote. The compulsory or the normative body, as it becomes impressed and repeated onto the narrative of how bodies take up or occupy space, shapes the ways in which games anticipate users and thus function to accommodate the immersion or comfort of a particular group of gamers. White, cis, straight, and male gamers are impressed and expected within game systems through the way in which mainstream games are designed to be allegories of control, empowerment, and seamlessness, affects that mimic the experience of privilege in space. Those that do not fit into this compulsory or normative identity, however, experience a heightened awareness of the surfaces of interaction and the limits of control, representation, and power in games. Queer games can critique and call attention to the norms and defaults that exist in the way video games operate mechanically. They centralize the experience of not fitting by questioning the assumed norms experienced within many mainstream games. These games push against norms of power, control, fulfilled desire, and liberation that are an experience specific to an expected, privileged demographic of gamers, and not necessarily applicable to queer or unexpected and unaccounted subjects. How might we push against these norms within video games that reify the experience of power and control and comfort as primary affects within games? How might we decentralize comfortable affects and consider how queering affect might work within queer game studies? Realistic female first-person shooter deliberately criticized the ways in which games have been designed to be comfortable for an audience of male gamers at the expense of exclusion of others. Anthropy writes that the game is, quote, "based on a post on a men's rights forum. Forum member XTC conjectured about what a first-person shooter with a woman lead character would be like. Not one of those unrealistic, strong female character games forced on us by a feminist-controlled media, but a game that depicts how a woman might actually perform in a role we're accustomed to seeing male characters in. The game itself is based on exclusionary male spaces that purposefully have been used to estrange and forcibly make spaces uncomfortable for women. In RFFPS, Anthropy examines the idea of power within the first-person shooter genre, questioning who these systems of power might be legible to, whose bodies are normalized, welcome, and comfortable within first-person shooter genres, and whose bodies are not addressed and don't fit within the normative spaces impressed by male bodies. The file designdoc.txt that comes with the executable file for the game contains the design influences, or so-called design influences, mentioned by the men's rights member XDC. It reads, "It would be hilarious to portray the female characters realistically. If you chose the female character in your FPS, she would have to move very slowly, dragging the gun around. You could build in some extra shake into the crosshairs to represent hopeless accuracy. Every time you needed to reload your gun, instead of pressing a button, you'd have to find a male character to go through some flirting dialogue options to persuade him to do it for you. 1 out of every 4 missions, the game would tell you that you were sitting this one out due to women's issues." In this design document, it becomes apparent the way in which reductive characterization of men's and women's bodies are intimately connected and reliant on one another for characterization. The unacknowledged empowerment of the male body can only exist through the deliberate disempowerment of the female body. We can see in the male body's absence what it means to this men's rights forum poster to be male in space, and what these phenomenologies are. Women move slowly and clumsily, men move quickly and with grace. Men are accurate and use weapons and other technologies of war effortlessly. Women are hopeless. Men experience empowerment in the acts they are capable of in space. Women must ask men to do these acts for them, trading their sexuality for favors. Men do not have periods and are reliable, and women are not. Women, in their strict definition, through what they cannot do, determine what men can do. Feminist theorist Elizabeth Gross writes about the fantasy of perfect control and liberation as, quote, "a fantasy of disembodiment, a megalomaniacal attempt to provide perfect control in a world where things tend to become messy, complicated, or costly." She writes that, end quote, she writes that these fantasies of control are necessarily bodily specific, where gender itself invisibly figures the way that bodies are theorized as empowered or disempowered. She writes about the idea of a sexual relation in which the body of a man figures for nothing, hiding himself in the gaze it directs outward to the female body, end quote. In the same way, the male body within XTC's discussion of what a game in the perspective of women would be like is formless. It takes up space. Its definition is static and defined by the deliberate demarcation of where women ends and women begins, or the boundaries of what women, or the boundaries that women are not allowed to cross. Gross writes, quote, "The problem that women feminists face is that the body that underlines the frame and frames the terms of representation has always been the functioning male body under the name of the neutral human," end quote. The white, cis, heterosexual male body is a specter that is unacknowledged in game and game studies. It haunts games as a functional norm. It is able. It contains full potentials and futures. It is unhindered and comfortable. It takes up space. It exists unacknowledged in the logics and mechanics of games that tell the player that she is able to overcome, feel empowered, and avoid failure as an unquestioned norm. It exists as an entity that is fully defined and unnamed, one that takes its constitution from the marginalized identities that it renders invisible. Women, queer people, trans and gender nonconforming people, those with disabilities, and people of color. It renders marginalized bodies as in-between, bodies that can only be defined in silhouette. This in-between, this undefined place where male bodies pointedly do not inhabit, can be a space of empowerment. While the edges of toxic masculinity remain static, those that it excludes can occupy spaces of motion, movement, and becoming. Gross writes that, quote, the in-between is the only space of movement, of development, of becoming. The in-between defines the space of a certain virtuality, a potential that always threatens to disrupt the operations of the identities that constitute it," end quote. The in-between is opaque and undefined, a kind of queer opacity that can be used as a site of resistance. It functions both as a strategy for survival and as a site of subversion and fraying, of undoing the privileged bodies that constitute it. Anthropy, by calling attention to the constructedness of the expectation of freedom and liberation in the first-person shooter, pushes against the ways in which privileged bodies have defined what it means to play games and what these experiences are. Queer games have the potential to decentralize white masculinity as the primary focus of experience within games by calling attention to queer affects and queer interfaces, queering and questioning the way the body engages with technology, and creating new potentials for what it means to be a queer body that plays games. And that's it. Yeah.